You didn't find this video. It appeared after something inside you changed. Not enough to turn you into someone else, but enough that you can no longer pretend nothing has changed. Maybe you can't say exactly when it happened. There was no decision, no rupture, no clear moment, just a silent shift. Something moved out of place without making a sound. This is the invisible point where nothing collapses, but nothing fits the same way anymore. You still wake up, you still reply to messages, you still move through your day, but something inside stopped keeping pace. It isn't sadness, it isn't intense confusion, it isn't a crisis. It's a strange resistance to continuing exactly as before, as if repeating certain gestures now requires more effort than it should, as if some part of you paused to observe, because this point doesn't announce change, it simply makes it impossible not to notice that something has already begun. Without realizing it, you started doing things you didn't do before, taking longer to reply to messages, canceling plans without guilt. You didn't decide this, it just happened. You didn't fight with anyone, there was no defining event, nothing exploded, and still, something changed in the way you respond. Before, you explained yourself. Now, you simply observe. Before, you insisted. Now, you step back. Before, you felt urgency. Now, you feel limits. It isn't disinterest. It's selectivity emerging without warning. You didn't grow cold. You became less available to what weighs you down. And maybe the strangest part is this. You don't feel the urge to return to the old behavior. Not because you know what you want now, but because you know what you can no longer tolerate. Some conversations end sooner. Some decisions happen without internal debate. You're still living the same life, but you respond as if you were somewhere else inside. No ritual, no announcement, no explanation, just a new boundary that began enforcing itself. And when this happens, it isn't emotional confusion. It's the first external sign that something internal has already moved to a place you can't return from unchanged. Crisis, a strange phase, self-sabotage. That's how the mind tries to name what's happening. But those names don't explain, they only soothe. Because what you're feeling isn't confusion, it's incompatibility. You didn't lose capacity. Short pause. You lost alignment. The way you learned to function still exists, but it no longer fits. Not because something went wrong, but because something changed. Without asking permission, what once sustained effort now demands depletion. What once flowed now requires too much justification. And when even what works starts to weigh on you, that isn't failure, it's a limit. Not as punishment, but as a silent warning. Something in your system has already moved forward, and staying the same now costs more than it sustains. When this discomfort appears, the impulse is immediate. Fix it. Get back into rhythm. Recover motivation. Push a little harder, as if the problem were a lack of strength. So you reorganize your routine, change methods, promise a fresh start on Monday, not because it truly makes sense, but because stopping feels frightening. The mistake isn't wanting to improve. The mistake is trying to function the same way. Inside a system that has already changed, you try to regain control at the exact point where control stopped working. From the outside it looks like discipline. On the inside, it's resistance. Resistance to accepting that what brought you here cannot take you forward. And the more you try to return to the old rhythm, the heavier everything becomes. Not because you're regressing, but because the body has already understood what the mind is still negotiating. This is where many people freeze, not from lack of ability, but from insisting on sustaining a version of themselves whose shift has already ended. And the problem isn't continuing to try, it's failing to notice That effort is now being spent, not to move forward, but to avoid changing. What's happening isn't a collapse, and it isn't a lack of energy. It's a shift in internal reference. For a long time, you functioned through effort, enduring, compensating, adapting. That works until the cost becomes too high. When that threshold is reached, the body changes before the mind. That's why the fatigue feels strange. It isn't physical, it isn't emotional, it's resistance. Resistance to repeating patterns that no longer make sense. The brain begins to filter differently. What used to be tolerable now weighs more. What once ran automatically now demands too much effort. Not because you became fragile, but because you became more precise. What's unfolding isn't breakdown, it's an update. And real updates never announce themselves. You only notice that certain responses have stopped working. Forcing doesn't solve it. Ignoring doesn't solve it. Because the system isn't asking for more effort. It's asking for adjustment. You're not waiting for something to change. You've already entered the change. That's why nothing feels clear. Because alignment doesn't begin when everything makes sense. It begins when the old stops responding. What always worked simply loses effect. It doesn't explode. It doesn't collapse. It doesn't warn you. It just stops sustaining. The mind calls this an error. Looks for a cause, searches for a solution, demands an explanation. But it isn't failure, it's replacement. The old system is being powered down, while the new one hasn't taken over yet. And that interval is the most uncomfortable point of all. There's no drive, no excitement, no certainty, only the strange sense that staying the same is no longer possible. While moving forward isn't visible yet. This is where almost everyone tries to go back, not because they want to, but because they recognize it. The familiar feels safe, when the next step has no shape yet. But this stage doesn't allow a return, not because you changed too much, but because something in you has already stopped agreeing. You feel it when you try to repeat the pattern, and the body grows heavy. When you force enthusiasm, and something locks. When you try to convince yourself, and no longer believe it. This isn't confusion, it's awareness, arriving before structure. Alignment doesn't begin by organizing your life. It begins by dismantling what is no longer true. No announcement, no audience, no applause. The change happens first in silence, and by the time you notice, you're already inside it. What confuses you is that this doesn't feel like growth. It feels like loss. Loss of rhythm, loss of clarity, loss of direction. Not because you're worse, but because the reference point has changed. You're using old measurements to evaluate a new system. It's like trying to drive while looking only in the rearview mirror. Nothing fits, because you've already passed a place where those rules made sense. On the outside, life keeps functioning. On the inside, the automatic brakes. What used to push you, now weighs you down. What once motivated you, now drains you. The brain calls this chaos. But it isn't disorder. It's a structural exchange. Before, habit sustained you. Now, only coherence does. Before, effort solved things. Now, only meaning does. And until this new logic stabilizes, everything feels provisional. Anxiety appears not from fear of the future, but because the old way of deciding has ended. The system searches for predictability, and doesn't find it yet, not because it's gone, but because it's being redesigned. This stage doesn't ask for fast answers. It asks for tolerance of the void, because it's in the space between one mode of functioning and another. That alignment consolidates, not by bringing certainty, but by removing what no longer belongs, and that, inevitably, looks like mess before it becomes direction. This is where most people try to fix things quickly. When this stage begins, the mind shifts into emergency mode. It doesn't try to understand what's changing. It tries to make the discomfort stop. And almost everyone reacts the same way. More thinking, more planning, more attempts to organize everything. The intention is relief. The mind believes that if it regains control, the discomfort will disappear. The problem is that this control system was built for a version of functioning that has already ended. It operates with old maps in a territory that has changed. That's why nothing fits. You revisit past decisions, consider familiar paths, gravitate toward predictable versions of your life. Those options feel safe because they're recognizable, and familiarity sounds like stability. When everything is being redrawn, another common reaction is searching for fast answers, naming everything too quickly, defining the process before it reveals itself, turning the transition into an identity that freezes the internal movement, because this stage doesn't ask for definition, it asks for space. This isn't a moment to announce change, or to finalize decisions, or to declare reinvention. It's a moment to allow the new to organize itself without interference. The more you pressure understanding, the more diffuse everything becomes. Some clarity only emerges when the system feels permission. This stage requires containment. It asks you to stop forcing adjustment, to interrupt the attempt to return, to suspend the search for immediate meaning. What is emerging now doesn't respond to command, it responds to space. And every time you try to resolve this too quickly, the process doesn't move forward, it's interrupted. Something begins to shift, without announcement, without spectacle, silently. You notice it in the details, in how certain arguments lose their grip, and how some impulses dissolve more quickly. In the absence of urgency, where pressure used to live, the world remains the same. Your relationship with it does not. Some things stop provoking reaction. Others pass without demanding response. There is less internal explanation, less mental rehearsal, less need to anticipate outcomes. The body begins to choose before the mind justifies. Small decisions resolve themselves. Limits appear without speeches. Distances form without conflict. There is no euphoria. There is precision, a quiet sense that certain weights no longer ask to be carried. You don't feel better. You feel more exact, less scattered, less fragmented. Some silences remain comfortable. Something has stopped, demanding constant explanation. The noise lowers, and in its place, a stable presence emerges, not as certainty, but as ground, as if, for the first time, you were aligned along your own axis, without running, without proving, without deciding yet, simply noticing that something inside has finally stopped fighting. Alignment doesn't push you forward, it simply interrupts your permanence in what is no longer true. Now, time asks for a different posture, not speed, not strategy, honesty. Honesty with what already demands internal effort to maintain, with what you keep only out of familiarity, with the silent cost of occupying spaces that no longer sustain who you have become. You didn't lose rhythm. You reached a point where continuing unchanged consumes more energy than adjusting direction. Nothing needs announcement. Nothing needs immediate explanation. Nothing needs conclusion today. There is only a simple recognition. Some versions of you were left behind, and insisting on them has begun to charge a price that now you can feel